I'm Sebastian Giovanni, and you're watching a documentary of evolution. Today I'm going to be talking about Charles Darwin's studies and observations about the theory of evolution. Darwin's life's works involved analyzing the many discoveries and observations he made on this journey. He was fortunate to visit a wide variety of habitats, especially the remote and isolated Galapagos Islands. Geologists were suggesting that Earth was ancient and had changed over time. Biologists were suggesting that life had also changed through a process they called evolution. Darwin developed a theory of biological evolution that offered a scientific explanation for the unity and diversity of life by proposing how modern organizations evolved through descent from common ancestors. Darwin's work confirmed that the living world is constantly changing. Evolutionary theory helps us understand events such as the emergence and spread of drug-resistant bacteria and new strains of influenza. It helps us predict the damages we will face if human actions drive too many species to extinction. Darwin was impressed by many ways that different organisms obtained food, protected themselves, and produced offspring. As his experiment went on over time, Darwin focused on three patterns of diversity. 1. Species vary globally. 2. Species vary locally. And 3. Species vary over time. Darwin observed other examples of local variation in the Galapagos Island, which impressed him again. He described it as a little world within itself. In addition to collecting specimens of living species, Darwin also collected fossils, preserved remains, or traces of ancient organisms. Darwin noted that the fossils record included many extinct animals that were similar to yet different from living species. Darwin worked out the main elements of evolution by natural selection soon after reading Malthus and thinking about artificial selection. In 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which described his ideas in detail. Darwin's contribution was to describe a natural process, a scientific mechanism that could operate like artificial selection. Malthus' work had convinced Darwin that if all populations have the potential to produce more offspring that can survive, members of a population will compete for a finite supply of environmental resources. Any heritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment is called an adaptation. Adaptations can involve body parts or structures like a tiger's claws. Adaptations can involve colors like those that make camouflage possible. Some adaptations are physiological, like the way a plant carries out photosynthesis, or the way an animal hibernates to survive harsh winters. Many adaptations can involve behaviors such as social behavior and avoidance of predators.
Here are the important things to know about evolution or populations. 20th century genetics discovered that heritable traits are controlled by genes carried on chromosomes. Molecular genetic techniques can now test hypotheses about variation and selection, help us understand evolutionary change better than Darwin ever could. The genetic definition of a species is a population or group of populations of physically similar interbreeding organisms that do not interbreed with other such groups. A gene pool consists of all genes present in a population, including all aliases for each gene. Researchers describe gene pools by the numbers of different aliases they contain. Genotype, phenotype, and evolution. It is important to remember that natural selection selects an entire organism either to survive and reproduce or to die without reproducing. Mutations, much of the time, genes are duplicated and passed from one generation to the next without change. Still, other mutations may result in adaptations that improve an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. Remember that during meiosis, one member of each chromosome pair is shuffled randomly into each egg or sperm with one member of every other chromosome pair. Lateral genes transfer can occur between individuals of the same species or individuals of different species. Single gene traits controlled by a single gene may have only 2 or 3 distinct phenotypes depending on the number of aliases involved. Many traits are controlled by 2 or more genes and are called polygenic traits. At first, the early insecticides like DDT killed most insects, but after a few years the poison stopped working. These days, scientists develop new insecticides, but insects become resistant to those new weapons too. The resistant individuals survive and thrive because in dramatically reduced populations, there is less competition for resources. Resistant insects and bacteria survive and reproduce, passing resistant aliases to.
Biodiversity is diversity among and within plant and animal species in an environment. Biologists identify and organize diversity through a standardized system. Taxonomy is a system of naming and classifying organisms based on shared characteristics and universal rules. In the 1730s, Carolus Linnaeus developed a naming system called binomial nomenclature, in which each species is assigned to a two-part scientific name. Tree of Life suggests a way to classify organisms based on how closely related they are. The goal of evolutionary classification is to group species into larger categories that reflect lines of evolutionary descent, rather than overall similarities and differences. A cladogram is a diagram depicting patterns of shared characteristics among species. Evolutionary patterns are changes in anatomy, phylogeny, and behaviors that take place in clades larger than a single species. From the fossil record, paleontologists learn about structure of ancient organisms, their environment, and ways they lived. Radiometric dating uses the proportion of radioactive to stable isotopes to calculate the age of a sample. Geologic timescale is based on relative and absolute dating. Its major divisions are eons, eras, and periods.